God as the original Darwinist, according to Genesis 1. Darwin said that nature, through natural selection, is responsible for the creation of life and the development of species, speciation, the development of the great variety of life forms that we have throughout the world. Well, Genesis chapter 1 says the same thing. According to verse 20, quote, God said, let the waters bring forth the living creature. Then 24 continues this idea, quote, let the earth bring forth the living creatures. Now, quote, waters and, quote, earth taken together amount to nature. So God, the Creator, is turning the work of creating life over to nature. He is endowing nature with the ability to create life and create species. Notice God does not say, let me create life, the living creatures. No, it says that God said, let the waters bring forth the living creatures, and let the earth bring forth the living creatures. So this definitely rules out what is called special creation, where God takes a handful of mud or clay and shapes it into a fish or a dog, and then breathes into its mouth and makes it come alive. Genesis 1 rules out such childish notion as special creation. Try to get that into your heads. Let's go back over verse 20 plus verse 21 this time. Verse 20 reads, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life. And God created every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind. Notice that it says that they bring forth after their kind, but not just after their kind. For it combines, quote, abundantly with, quote, after their kind. So two different things are going on at the same time. The first few species are reproducing after their kind, but they are also tasked with bringing forth new species so that there can be an abundance. There can be abundant life. It speaks of, quote, every living creature, unquote, that exists throughout the world. In short, the first few species are going beyond reproducing after their kind. They are going on to produce new species so that there can be an abundance of life forms so that there can be an enormous variety of species. Where does this variety of species come from? It's being done by, quote, the waters and the first few species. For that is all that we are given in verses 20 and 21. Long story short, the implication is that speciation is occurring through the, quote, reproducing, quote, after their kind. So Genesis 1 is not saying that reproducing after their kind is absolute. Now, young earth creationists would claim that reproducing after their kind is absolute. But we don't have to take it as absolute. In other words, the new species are a side effect of species producing after their kind. In other words, 99.999% of the first species produced after their own kind, but a small fraction, let's say 0.00001%, would be mutant creatures that produce a new species. Well, this is the same sort of thing that Darwinists are saying. Darwin said it long ago, and Darwinists today are saying it. God in Genesis 1 really is playing the part of a Darwinist. There was a Darwinist up above long before there was a Darwin or Darwinists on the earth below. It really is a fact that new species come forth when a species is producing after its own kind. A reptile that already exists cannot morph into a mammal. The only way reptiles can produce mammals is for a mother reptile to have mutant genes in her ovum, and the father reptile to have mutant genes in his sperm. And when the egg and the sperm unite, the mutant genes can be expressed in terms of new organs that constitute a new species called, a new class of species called mammal. Now let's go over verse 20 and 21 one more time. It says, quote, that God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, and fowl that fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven," unquote. Now, why are fish and fowl mentioned together, being placed together? What is the logic of that? How can that be interpreted from a Darwinist point of view? Well, if we combine Genesis 1 with Hebrews 11 verse 3, we have an answer. Hebrews 11 verse 3 says that by faith we understand that the eons or ages were framed by the Word of God, And then it goes on to talk about visible things coming forth from non-visible things. And Paul, in the original Greek, uses the word A-I-O-N-O-S, which is where we get the English word eons. So Paul is saying that God created the eons or ages. And so on that basis, we can interpret the days in Genesis 1 as eons or ages. And therefore, day 5, where fish and birds are created, we can see that as a great, a long eon of time. And going by evolution theory or the law of evolution, the sequence is not so much of fish and then fowl or birds. It's everything. It's fish and fowl, but everything in between. In other words, fish and then amphibians, followed by reptiles, and then birds. In this way, we find that Genesis 1 is compatible with the law of evolution and the sequence of creation that according to evolution. Now we move on to day 6. It speaks of the age of mammals. There's the beasts of the field, there's cattle, and then there's creeping things, and then this is followed by God creating mankind. It says in verse 24 that God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creatures," and then they're listed as the beasts of the field, wild animals, and then there's the cattle, which represents the domesticated animals, and then there's the creeping things, and that's all. And then it separates what comes next. It says that God said, "Let us bring forth after our own kind." Actually, it says something a little bit different. It says, "Let us make man in our own image and likeness." But basically, it's putting mankind as though God is creating after his own kind. So that mankind collectively, not individual man, but collectively, mankind would be the offspring of God. Now we can see this sequence from a Darwinist point of view. The wild animals and the domesticated, that's one logical distinction, or two different categories. But the creeping thing comes after those two categories. And tree shrews are an example of creeping things. They creep along the ground, but they also climb. They're great climbers. And tree shrews are supposed to be the ancestors of monkeys and primates. So that's what they would represent. They would represent the source for what produces mankind. That God creates mankind through the monkeys, through the apes and the monkeys and the apes, and he creates the monkeys via the tree shrews. So there is a logical sequence. Man would be, obviously, man is the crown of the evolutionary progression, the crowning achievement of the law of evolution. I should emphasize or specify theistic evolution. It's not evolution by chance, it's evolution according to the will of God. I'm not saying that man owes his existence to the animals from which he came. Rather, he owes his existence to God, who created his body through the animals. But God created man's soul himself apart from the animals. It's a little bit like an adult man comes forth from the child, from the animal-like child. The child is crawling on all fours, a very young child. But he does not owe his existence to the child. He owes it to the mother, who is the creator figure. Now, in the same way, man owes his existence to God, the creator. Even though man does come via the animal progression. Now, Christ said he came to fulfill the law, which refers to the law of Moses, which can actually include or refer to Genesis 1, because the books of Moses are called the law of Moses, and Genesis chapter 1 is the first chapter in that particular book, the book of Genesis, which is written by Moses. Now, Genesis 1 in particular is in desperate need of being fulfilled. Now, fulfill can mean to complete Genesis 1. And Christ does complete Genesis 1 through Paul the Apostle, using Paul as his instrument, his surrogate. You see, Paul Paul the Apostle takes the days in Genesis 1 of creation week and turns them or magnifies them into eons. This is in Hebrews 11, verse 3, like I mentioned before. Now, this is normal. What do you do with an acorn? You plant it in the ground, and it grows into an oak tree. The seed or the acorn is not meant to remain an acorn. It's not fulfilled until it grows into a tree. And I'm telling you today, the days in Genesis 1, in order for them to reach their potential, to maximize their potential, they have to be magnified and blown up into the eons that Paul speaks of in Hebrews 11, verse 3. Genesis 1, with its 7 days of creation week, we can transform them. We have the right, we have the duty to transform them into 7 eons. But actually, each of those days is divided into 2 periods because it speaks of the evening and the morning of the first day, of the second day, and so on. And so instead of 7 periods, it's 14 periods. And the number 14 corresponds to the Big Bang theory, which says the universe is 14 billion years old. And the 14 in Genesis 1 is a token. It turns Genesis 1 into a microcosm, a miniature account of the Big Bang and the age of the universe, the development of the universe in miniature. I know it's a little bit unclear, but the 14, when I discovered that the number 14 could be actually, applied, or the 7 days could be turned into 14 periods based on the evening and the morning. This is one of my greatest breakthroughs, if I may say so. I must not end this video without emphasizing that if we expand the time frames of the days of Genesis 1, we also have to expand or change the events that occur within those time frames. Just like if you have a small picture with a small picture frame, and then you have a picture frame, like say 10 times bigger. Well, you've got to take that picture and blow it up so it'll fill out the picture frame, the new picture frame. And so for example, in day 3, where it talks about the waters receding and letting the land appear, the dry land appear. Well, let's say the land is uneven, and so it would be the hilltops that appear first, and the hilltops would actually be islands. And going by the Big Bang theory, because of the location of day 3, it's right after day 1, which is the Big Bang, and day 2 is the expansion. Day 3 would be galaxy formation. And what are galaxies if not islands in the seas of space? And so that's an example of taking what's in instead of taking the events as face value, we take them metaphorically. And one more thing. According to the Big Bang theory and the extension of the Big Bang theory, the solar system came into existence as a package. So day 4, where the sun is created, sun and the moon, that would be the time when the earth is created. And so when it speaks of the earth in day 1, 2, and 3, we take that non-literally. We have to explain that away. Now in day 1, it says the earth was void and without form. Well, that's the perfect statement or description. If we want to deny that the earth exists, because if something is void, that's another way of saying it's not there. And if something is formless to the nth degree, then that's another way of saying it's not there. And so the deep, which is the ocean, is not there either, because the ocean is part of the earth. And if the earth is absent, then the ocean is absent also. So when it talks about the great deep, it's talking about an ocean of nothingness. It's totally figurative. And, okay, that's enough for this video. And I'm going to try to write a transcript in the description box so you can make a copy on paper so that when EMP occurs, possibly as late as recent, I mean as soon as October the 1st, which is the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, I'm expecting the Russian attack, and anyway, and then Christ will come in and defeat the Russians. I should add that. Also, the time that the Russians rule the world will only be 5 months. 5 months. That's from the book of Revelation, chapter 9, verse 5 and 10.